Welcome to One Bite is Everything, the podcast that connects every bite you take to the bigger world. Because food isn't just food. It's health, and land, and labor, economy, and power, all on your plate. I'm your host, Dana DePrima. On this show, I bring you fascinating perspectives from countless thought leaders, innovators, scientists, industry leaders, the insiders, and the agitators, and policymakers from all over. But just as important, you'll hear from the people who live inside the food system every single day. The farmers, the producers, the ones working quietly behind the scenes, making decisions that shape what ends up on your fork. Today's guest is one of those people. Dave Fisher is the founder of Fisher Farms in Indiana. He's a lifelong farmer, but also a former industrial engineer and supply chain expert who spent years working in global manufacturing before returning to the land. That combination matters because Dave doesn't just raise cattle. He understands how systems work, where they break, where power concentrates, where quality gets lost, and where real opportunity lives. This conversation goes deep. We talk about beef supply and pricing, climate and methane, soil biology, processing bottlenecks, consolidation, and what happens when a food system is optimized for efficiency instead of nourishment. We talk about why quality doesn't travel backward through the supply chain, why farmers are often price takers instead of price makers, and why rebuilding regional food systems isn't romantic. It's logistical, technical, and essential. I haven't always been in this place. I didn't wake up one day fluent in food systems. I got here by asking questions, and I'm still learning and still asking questions. By sitting in uncomfortable gray areas, by realizing that while many of us were busy living our lives, our food system quietly industrialized around us in ways that don't serve our health, our land, our farmers, or our communities, especially the regional ones we have turned to and will rely on when things get tough. This episode is honest, transparent, and incredibly clarifying. If you've ever felt confused by headlines about beef, climate, prices, or food policy, or if you sense that something about the way we eat just doesn't add up, this conversation will help connect some of those dots. So let's get into it.
Beef has had its cycles for years. They used to always talk about a 7-year beef cycle. But what has really impacted that were the droughts that really started about 10 years ago and kind of moved in different places in the country up until really the last couple years. So we had an extended time period where cattle producers were facing drought situations. And when you've got that, not only do you have to, your cost increase because you got to buy feed and so forth, but some of these farmers, because it impacted such a large geography, you just can't ship the feed that far. And so a lot of them downsized. It was only about 3 years ago where there was just an overwhelming number of mama cows being brought to auctions, and they were lined up down the road and so forth. I, in particular, we did not have a drought condition, so I was buying some of these cheap cows, unfortunately for the producer. But a lot of farms, a lot of ranches out west, especially in the center of the country, if you go from the Dakotas down to Texas, that area is about 70% of the beef in the United States. And that area really got impacted by droughts. And then the farmer is looking at it and saying, okay, I just sold these mama cows for $1,500. Am I really going to go spend $3,000 now that everybody's trying to buy them to repopulate, knowing that in a couple of years I may have to sell out again because another drought hits? So I would say this inconsistent weather has really been the driver for it. There's a little bit of aging farmers. Some of the grasslands on the federal grazing permits were restricted, which reduced some of the grazing areas as well. But that's really what started this high prices over the last, 3 years or so. And the difficult part is it takes a long time to rebuild. I just bought about 200 heifers And I look at those girls and I'm going to be breeding them this summer, and I'm not going to have a product to sell from them until 2029. So it's a long-term investment. Interest rates don't help, but just rebuilding the herd is not a quick thing. And you compare that to, chickens, which are very fast turnaround. Hogs are 3 times a year. With cows, it's a 9-month gestation, one calf per year, about 20 months until you've got that calf grown. So it just takes a long time and a lot of capital to rebuild that herd.
Interesting. And you're also in the pork and poultry business, is that right?
We sell our neighbors pork, and so we do about 100 hogs a week from them, and we do about 40 beef, just kind of give you a scale. On the poultry side, we messed around with it a little bit doing it ourselves, but we resell Miller's Amish chicken, which is from northern Indiana.
Okay. I do want to get into the selling part, but I have a couple of other questions.
Sure.
Just because I feel like there's a ping pong game going on around all of this. Can we just talk about like the issues that people point out with cows? Cows produce methane from belching. We talk about cows on the ground and carbon sequestration. And I had an interview with a guy who's not a rancher about cows, and no matter where you put them, they're creating the same amount of methane. It's slightly better to have them on grass because in a CAFO, there's that consolidated waste, right? Like, so just help me explain these environmental arguments. And is having our cattle on grass actually controlling the emissions?
Yeah, unfortunately, I would probably disagree with that. A big part of it is what is the cattle's diet? I should also say we did a large USDA project where we hired research scientists to help us do a life cycle assessment on our farm and really analyze there's greenhouse gas going up in the air, how are we putting it in the ground, and how much are we putting in the ground? And it was really interesting. It came down to 3 things, and all the rest is really noise. It comes down to the methane emissions, and mostly it's methane emissions out of their mouth, not out of the manure. If you store the manure in an anaerobic environment, it will create methane. But most people say, hey, let's just store it aerobically as we do and spread it back out on the field so it doesn't create methane after it comes out of the cow. It's the belching. They belch a tremendous amount of methane. That's 95% of the methane comes out of their mouth. So dealing with that and trying to figure out ways to reduce that is one thing. So I'll talk about that in a little bit.
What gets lost in the manure and methane debate is how neatly it distracts us from the uncomfortable truth. We keep trying to engineer around a system problem instead of questioning the system itself. Yes, manure stored anaerobically produces methane, and yes, spreading it back onto fields in aerobic conditions reduces that. But nearly all of a cow's methane doesn't come from waste at all. It comes from belching, from a digestive process that's being pushed beyond its natural limits. Roughly 95% of methane is exhaled, not excreted, which means that the real issue isn't how we store manure. It's how we've designed industrial animal agriculture. We've bred and confined animals for maximum output, fed them unnatural diets to accelerate growth, and concentrated them in numbers ecosystems were never meant to hold. The controversy isn't really about cows versus climate. It's about scale, speed, and extraction. We're asking biological systems to behave like machines, then scrambling for technical fixes when nature pushes back. Methane inhibitors, feed additives, and manure digesters may shave off emissions at the margins, but they don't address the deeper question: why we rely on a model that requires constant mitigation to justify its own existence. If cows are belching methane at unprecedented levels, it's not because they're inherently the problem. It's because we've turned living, grazing animals into industrial units, and we're trying to regulate the symptom without reckoning with the design flaw at the center.
The next area is nitrogen fertilizer. Nitrogen fertilizer, before it comes to the farm, has a horrible greenhouse gas footprint. So reducing nitrogen, the second of the levers. And then the third lever is putting carbon in the ground. So we've worked really hard over the last 20 years. At first, we kind of stumbled into it, and then we figured out with a professor from University of Kentucky that we're actually putting a lot of carbon deep into the ground. And we did an analysis to show that we're putting down about 4,000 pounds of carbon per acre per year. And that's kind of my background picture. It is showing me playing in the dirt, as I like to say, but looking at those roots going deep into the ground. And that's how we really deposit a lot of carbon.
And how does that compare? Like, what's the baseline we're comparing
Right.
that 4,000 pounds against?
In general, if you're looking at a corn and soybean field where they till, you're actually losing carbon. So by not tilling, by having these deep-rooted grasses, we're putting a lot down, 4,000 pounds. And that it doesn't offset the greenhouse gas emissions from the methane and from the nitrogen fertilizer, but we're getting there. We're working on it. And I can also talk to how our farm compares to the typical beef industry. There's a gentleman, Dr. Rotz, out of Pennsylvania, who's done a lot of analysis. He worked with us on this. And we're somewhere around, as of our practices of 2 years ago, we're about a 50% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. And we've got plans in place, or at least a outline of how we can get it down to zero. But it's going to take some more research and some more steps to get that way.
I so appreciate your transparency on that. I think that people are really befuddled by all the numbers. And I think sometimes the headlines, really just want to whip things up without really getting into the details.
I totally agree. And it's always in the details where the issues are. And, on methane emissions in particular, we feed 3 products right now. So we feed brown kelp, probiotics, and garlic. And all 3 of those will have some impact to reduce the methane. There's basically microbes in the rumen, methogens, that produce this methane. And so if you can suppress those, you suppress the methane production. It's actually beneficial to the cattle, gives them more energy because they're not wasting this and making gas going up in the air. There's another product by Elanco called Bovaer, which also does this. But we've decided as a farm, because we sell natural meat and so forth, we're not going to feed our animals chemicals. So we're not going that route. But we are, like I said, right now, we're using those 3 products. And we're working with a company in Australia, CH4 Global. They are really doing a lot of research and really the leading ones on this red seaweed product. And we hope to first place in the United States to test this product and see how much of a methane reduction we get from it. So we've got our barn set up to where we'll be able to measure it and so forth. So that's exciting to me and where we can go. But in the short term, we're also taking a lot of steps like reducing our nitrogen use, putting more carbon in the ground, different things that we're doing there as well.
And when you say reducing your nitrogen, that's in terms of like providing supplemental fertilizer to your fields?
Yes. And so like when we grow corn, or we used to grow a lot of sorghum sudan grass or forage sorghum, which uses less nitrogen than corn, but still uses quite a bit. What we've done over the last couple of years is switch to a 9-way and then last year a 12-way mix on our summer annuals. And with that mix, we've got enough legumes in the mix to where we don't have to add nitrogen fertilizer. It's basically no fertilizer, and we had tremendous growth. So we're headed down more that route, replacing our corn acres, replacing our corn silage in the diet with more of this kind of product where we don't have to have the chemical fertilizer.
Well, that's a very interesting finding. And I'm wondering now how other farmers are learning about what you're doing and seeing what that efficacy is, because I think not everybody wants to test, right? Like they kind of
Right.
want a shortcut. And so if they can do what you're doing and get rid of their corn and their nitrogen and get these other benefits, how are
Right.
they learning about what you're doing?
So we've worked closely with the USDA and have had really open books on these kind of things. Like I said, they paid for a lot of the climate research that we did. And in exchange, we're going to treat ourselves as a bit of I call it on-farm research. We're not replacing university research, but we kind of verify and test what has been done in the university and say, okay, can we do this at scale? Can we deal with the weather conditions and all those kind of things with it as well? So we've tried to be very much so an open book, and I go around speaking at different farmer conferences. We have a farmer field day every year in August where we invite farmers to our farm. And I would also say just through our production as we've expanded, we're working with now 35 farmers. And they're doing different roles for us. Some of them are grazing our cattle. Some have their own cattle that we buy their feeder cattle. So, just a lot of different ways. And with that, they have to follow our practices. And not to the point where they're on the bleeding edge with us on some of these, but to where we've got, certain known practices that work that we know produce really good quality beef. They have to follow those practices.
Let me ask you about processing, because there's a lot of interest, I think, in the fact that we only have four of the big processors, that everything is really consolidated with those processors. And when, something happens with those processors, there's a ripple effect or a domino effect with ranchers and prices and consumers and your ability to set prices. And I know you have some other models, but I'm just curious what your take is on where we sit with the fact that we have these four major processors.
It really is a monopoly. They really control it. And yes, we have four. First of all, two of them are owned by Brazilian conglomerates. One is privately held, Cargill, and then you've got the fourth, Tyson. And then if you look at it from a farmer's perspective, like we work with a farmer just about 30 minutes away from us. I was buying his cattle, and he says it's so nice to have another option. Before he had one option, and that was to sell his cattle to the Tyson plant in Illinois. That's the closest plant. So even though there's four of them, in your area, there's probably not four of them. And so from a farmer's perspective, very much so a price taking, not a price making perspective.
From a price taking perspective, the farmer isn't participating in a market. They're reacting to it. They don't negotiate value, they absorb it. This is the quiet power of monopoly. Not just control over processing, but control over who gets to set reality. When a farmer finally gets another option, it's not about competition. It's about dignity, leverage, and survival. The deeper issue isn't efficiency or global ownership. It's that we've built a food system where producers carry the risk, the volatility, and the moral burden of feeding people, while pricing power flows upward to entities far removed from land, from animals, and from communities. Price takers don't shape markets, they endure them. And when the people closest to the food have the least say in its value, something fundamental about fairness, resilience, and food security has already been lost.
And then from the customer, we work with a lot of restaurants. And so I understand from them, they're viewing things. And to them, it really doesn't matter where it comes from. But generally, there's only one or two suppliers that can meet their needs. And it also seems like there's a little bit of dividing up the market at the big four level. And then it's really more than just processing, though, because it's the whole supply chain. Beef in the general supply chain changes hands 6 times from the time the calf is produced until it's on the plate at a restaurant.
Give me the path.
So cow-calf producer sells to a grower or a stocker where they will take them from like 600 pounds to 800 pounds, usually out on grass. Kansas wheat fields is a typical place. Then they go to a feedlot. From the feedlot, they're sold to the big packers. The big packers will then sell different parts to different further processing plants, like a ground beef patty plant. The ground beef patty plant will then sell to a food distributor such as Sysco, US Foods, and so forth. And then it finally goes to the end restaurant. So a lot of hoops. One thing I've noticed is the quality signal, as we talked about in supply chain management, doesn't make it back. And sometimes it makes it back to the feedlot, but almost always it doesn't make it back all the way back to the cow-calf guy. And the cow-calf guy is really the guy selecting the genetics and the initial feed program, which is so critical to the quality of the meat.
What you mean by that is that when it gets to the end place, the traceability on quality is minimized?
It is, and it's just not known. When a farmer sells his cattle, and I'll tell you, when I was selling feeder cattle, I went up to a guy at the auction yard who was buying literally 75% of the cattle in our area. And he's just standing there with his hand in the air, buying everything. And I went up to him and said, how do you determine your pricing? Are you looking for quality? Because I bought these really good quality genetics I was all proud of. And he got right up in my face, pointed into my chest and said, you don't worry about quality, you worry about quantity. You bring me the biggest calf and that's how you're going to make your money. And I think that's just typical of what happens. The guy who's deciding on genetics is not worried near as much about quality as if you were actually selling it to the end customer.
And tell me, just from a genetic standpoint, like, what is a responsible rancher? Like, what are you
Right.
looking for?
Yeah. So we're really looking for a few things. One is, the tenderness of the meat as well as the marbling and just the overall taste profile of the meat. So to do that, like I said, it really starts off with the genetics is number one, but then it's also how you feed that cow and how you feed the calf. So we do a lot of things with creep grazing to make sure the calf, while it's still on the mother, has access to better pasture than the mother does, which is a big part of it as well. But then after the calf is weaned, we put them out on a lot of ryegrass pastures that you see in my background to make sure that, they get that growth. One of the things that we've seen, and there was a study by Michigan State that showed that if the calf is not gaining 1.75 pounds per day, they're not getting enough energy. And again, think these are 600, 700-pound calves. It's not like us gaining 2 pounds a day. But anyways, if they don't have that energy, they're like a teenager growing and you're starving them. So they're getting a bigger frame. They're growing up, but they're getting skinnier. And to support that growth in the frame, they pull the fat cells out of the meat. And this is well known, been documented that if you're not feeding them enough, that gets pulled out. And then at the end, when you send them off to the feedlots, and they all want these skinny calves coming into the feedlot, that they're then going to bloom and they're going to grow fast, but they're putting the fat on the outside of the muscle. And like you can think of like the ribeye where it has the big chunk of fat down the middle and on the outside, that's where the fat goes, not into the marbling and the meat. So we take a very different approach where we make sure that calf has a good diet in front of it its whole life. And during the finishing phase, we shoot for about 2.5 pounds a day of gain per day, very much so based on forages. We're not trying to really push that calf to in the feedlots. They'll get 4.5 pounds of gain per day because they're feeding 80% grain. We feed 20% grain just to make sure they've got enough energy, but still very much so forage based, so their rumen is not impacted and they don't get into things like acidosis.
So if I'm a cattle rancher and I don't want to sell into Tyson or whatever my most local processor is, I have maybe some local opportunities, USDA slaughterhouses that are smaller. I understand those are in high demand and some of them are closing.
Yeah, during COVID, they were in extremely high demand. Since COVID, there's been some new plants. USDA actually helped with a lot of the funding for new equipment and expansions and so forth. So at least in our area right now, there is plenty of capacity. Processing capacity is not the bottleneck.
During COVID, cracks in the meat supply chain turned into full fractures almost overnight. As outbreaks swept through large processing plants, the USDA shut down or slowed many major facilities to protect workers, instantly creating a bottleneck in a system already concentrated in the hands of just a few processors. Livestock backed up on farms, grocery shelves emptied, prices rose, and food insecurity worsened, not because animals or food were scarce, but because the system couldn't move them. Smaller USDA-inspected slaughterhouses became overwhelmed, booked months out, revealing how fragile a centralized model really was. In the years since, this specific choke point has been partially addressed. USDA funding and pandemic-era programs helped expand regional plants, upgrade equipment, and open new facilities, increasing local processing capacity in many areas. In some regions today, processing is no longer the primary bottleneck it once was, but the deeper lesson remains unresolved. The pandemic didn't just expose a temporary capacity issue. It exposed how easily a highly concentrated system can turn a disruption into a crisis. The problem wasn't only that plants closed, it was that there were too few alternatives when they did.
And so what I always tell farmers, if you want to do that, think through the whole, who is going to be your customer? How many beef are you going to market and so forth? And we started off doing the farmers market, half beef to individuals and so forth. And that's fine. We live in a pretty rural area, so there weren't really great farmers markets to go sell at. And so I found myself dragging 4 coolers to a farmer's market and dragging 3 of them still full when I came back home. So it just wasn't a really good fit for us. And that's when we started knocking on restaurant doors. So in the summer of 2005, I knocked on 17 restaurant doors one day with my daughter in tow, and I got one yes. And that yes led to us, okay, hey, we're going to start selling to restaurants.
What restaurant was that?
Chef David Talent's restaurant in Bloomington, Indiana, which is interesting enough. I just met with him yesterday. So 20 years later, he's still a good customer of ours. He's actually the executive chef at Indiana University across all their dining halls.
So your beef is going through dining halls now as well, through that
Yes.
relationship you had with that chef.
Yes. Actually, we got started with the university and then he left his restaurant and came back to the university. So we were already there, but he's been a great supporter of ours at Indiana University. But yeah, there's 9,000 freshmen a year come into their dorms and are eating our meat. And it's kind of interesting. The freshmen come in, they want cheeseburgers and French fries or chicken nuggets and French fries. And over the course of the semester, we can just see it in their order volume, and we hear it from the chefs how that changes over time as they get exposed to new options and so forth. They start off with what they're comfortable with, and then Indiana University really approaches it as it's part of their education. We want to teach the kids how to eat right. I call them kids because I'm hitting 60 here. But anyways, these students that, how to eat right, how to make good decisions, and it's all part of their educational program. And they use us in their marketing materials when they're talking about, why would you want to come to IU? Part of it is they buy a large percentage of their meat from a local farm.
That's very interesting and super responsible. Are you in other restaurants now as well?
Yeah, so we sell to over 200 restaurants and to about 50 or so individuals every week.
Those are all within the scope of Indiana. How far from you?
Yeah, I'd say about a 4 hour drive, which we've got just a few restaurants in Chicago, mostly Indianapolis, Bloomington, Louisville, Kentucky is only a little bit over an hour from us, Cincinnati, those areas. But mostly it started out in Bloomington and Indianapolis back in the day, back in 2006 kind of time frame. I was kind of a one-man shop. I say one man, but my wife was heavily involved as well. But I was the one selecting the genetics, then picking the animals, so which ones would get slaughtered that week. And then we dry age for 2 weeks, but then I'd be out there processing. And big thing that I did was monitor the steaks and really sort through the steaks. And then I was the guy delivering it to the restaurant, getting the feedback from the restaurant, and also finding out about the restaurant down the street that might be interested. So delivering and selling at the same time, but getting that feedback. And that's what really shaped our quality and what we did. So I figured out very quickly that if I took a 12-inch ruler and put it on the back of the calf, right in front of the back legs, if it touched on both sides, then I knew that animal was finished. I was going to get good marbling out of it. But also, I went through a lot of breed recommendations and tried, okay, I'll try 10 calves of this breed. I'll try 10 calves of that. And that really led us down the path of heavily Angus influence. But then within Angus, we look for the top 5% for marbling and for ribeye area. But then I also cross in some shorthorn, but just some shorthorn that have been proven to have good marbling.
And restaurants really value that, I'm assuming. That fat
Exactly.
marbling is better than the fat on the outside.
Exactly. They want it to taste, I would say, like it's been buttered from the inside out. That's what those little fine lines of marbling will do for you. And as we saw last week with the new nutritional guidelines, that fat is not as bad as we've been told over the last 50 years.
I have thoughts on the guidelines. One of the
Sure.
things that I worry about. Great. We need protein. We need beef. We need whole foods. We need real foods. We need less processed foods. we subsidize processed foods. I mean, you're moving away from corn, but I haven't seen any indication from the US government that we might step away from corn and figure out something edible and feed our cows maybe something better that helps with their methane production. So it's that, but how are we going to support if we're 45% or 47%, I think, of produce is coming in from other countries? Why?
Right.
And if you're going to put these guidelines out there and put Secretary Rollins front and center on this, where we're now
Yes.
talking about farms being important, which that rhetoric is important, but I want to see her put her money where her mouth is. And I just don't know that it's happening yet.
I totally agree that there are some programs, and Secretary Rollins in particular has gotten very interested and excited about what we're doing, especially as we supply schools. We've had numerous conversations with her about that, how to get local food into schools. We can show how it's actually cost effective for the local school. They get a much higher participation rate. So Secretary Rollins has been very interested in that, and very much so wants to work with us on developing programs. She told me last week when we were out in DC, how do we get 150 Fisher farms across the country? And so she wants our input on how to get that done and how to make it real and so forth. And so she's definitely of that mindset. And now, obviously, the proof's going to be in the pudding, as they say, of how is that going to work out into actual programs to help small producers and producers access new markets. It's not easy. And a lot of times it takes cooperation amongst numerous farmers to make it all happen. And like I said, we work with 35 farms. From the get-go, we worked with probably 5 or 6 because we sell eggs, we sell maple syrup. And, we hear that from our restaurant customers. Restaurant customers want to buy local, but it's so hard to buy green beans from one farmer, maple syrup from another, because you've got an invoice, you've got that ordering process. It's just inefficient. I always remember when I used to do all the deliveries myself, I would go into a bar in Bloomington, Nick's English Hut, and which has been a great customer of ours since 2006. And I'm there, and the local lady's delivering her green beans, and she's got 2 cases of green beans that might be worth $60. I'm like, how can you afford to do a delivery route? You've put so much effort into raising those green beans and the cost of that and so forth. And now you've got to go deliver it. And so working together to where we make the cost less for the farmer, but also for the restaurant or like a university purchasing. Indiana University, because of their overhead, they feel like every purchase order costs them $150. And so you can't buy green beans on a $150 purchase order. So what they've said is, why don't we, whenever we have a new farmer that wants to sell to Indiana University, we'll tell them to drop it off at your place. You add an administrative charge and then deliver it to us. So that's what we've been working with IU on. But it takes that cooperation, and it takes the market makers, if you will, in those areas.
I mean, I think you can make a lot of little changes on a little stage, but if you can make a little change on a big stage, that has a much bigger impact. So if Cisco decided or was pressured to take on green beans from small farms all over and to aggregate those on a regional basis, really supporting a regional economy, that would be a big change. And that would be a big benefit to that small farmer who doesn't want to have to drive her $60 green beans to the restaurant.
Cisco is so huge. So I will say we work with US Foods. They're a distributor of ours. So we've kind of got a glimpse into that over the last 5 years. And we love working with US Foods, but they view us as more of a marketing or a ticket into some restaurants. We're a differentiator for them. We have a product, a local high quality product that you can't get from Cisco in Indianapolis. You have to go through US Foods, or we have a couple other distributors. So they use that as a ticket in. And you also have to look from their perspective. They want to deliver a lot of boxes to that customer. And their cost is somewhere, I've heard it, between $50 and $80 every time they stop at a customer. So they want a lot of boxes, a lot of cases, a lot of different products, and being able to be that one-stop shop for that restaurant customer. So would love to see more and more pressure on those folks to deliver local products. And I don't really think it's going to come from regulations or government. It's got to come from the public, right? That's demanding it. Where did this come from? How fresh is this? And so forth. And that's how I see it, and that's why I love the concept of your podcast, right? You're voting with your dollars. Every time you go out and buy a meal, you serve a meal for your family, you're voting on how that system should look.
I wonder if you agree with this, but it's my assumption that consumers who are cooking at home are a little bit more concerned about where they're getting their meat. They might go to the farmer's market, they may buy direct from a farmer, right? And they're like, okay, well, this is what I serve my guests, this is what I serve my family. But when you go to a restaurant, you kind of turn off that bar. I mean, maybe you're going to a restaurant where they have an ethos. But a lot of times, you go to a restaurant and maybe it says Fisher Farms on it, maybe it says something else, and you don't really think about it. You're like, oh, that's nice. I don't know that we as consumers are really holding our restaurants to account.
I would say a little bit. We do see it, especially where we have built a brand in Indianapolis and Bloomington, that we have customers who are looking for our name on the menu. It's interesting. Why are they doing that? And I'd like to think that a portion of it is because they want to buy local, they want to help local economy and so forth. But when we polled our customers and asked them, why are they buying our meat? The number one answer was quality. Number two answer was that it's clean meat, that they don't have to worry about what we feed our animals. They don't have to worry about anything that we add during processing, that it's clean. Then everything else was down below, that it's local, that it's sustainable, carbon footprint, all those kind of things were much lower in importance to those customers. To me, it just makes a lot of sense, right? At the end of the day, you want something that really tastes good. I always say, I'd rather eat a peanut butter and jelly sandwich than eat a tough steak. I want something that's really going to taste good, and I want to serve that. If I was having a restaurant, that's what I want to serve. I've also heard from restaurants, when I was delivering and so forth, is every steak has to be good. And that's where we actually have an advantage because we know the genetics, we know the feed program. We're not like the big guys that do 6,000 head a day. They have 3 seconds to look at an animal, and usually they look at the 12th ribeye and say, okay, how good is this? And then it goes on. And it's also interesting, about 10 years ago, the USDA allowed the plants to do their own grading. So just like in schools, we have grade inflation. Now everything's choice, everything's prime, and so forth. And I've seen it at restaurants where they'll open up a case of choice ribeyes, and one looks really good and two don't look so good. And so they struggle with that. The restaurants struggle with it because, they're not getting consistent quality. Then they serve it to their customers. And now the chef's out talking to a table about why, the one person at the table got a good steak and the other guy didn't get a good steak. And that's not a conversation you want to have. Oh. So that's where we can really help restaurants. And, my favorite comment I ever got from an individual was they messaged on our website that when they go out to eat, they look for Fisher Farms items on the menu and they haven't been disappointed yet. And that's exactly what I want to see happen. And so I don't think as a local farmer, I can just say, hey, buy my meat because it's local. Buy my meat because it's natural. It doesn't have chemicals. Well, that's fine. A lot of people want that, but they also want it to taste really good and to have a really good experience with it. And especially from a restaurateur standpoint, he wants it to be really good quality. And you can't sacrifice quality to add in that it's local.
Let's go back to what Secretary Rollins was asking you in terms of let's get 100 more Fisher Farms across the country. How do we do that? Sounds hard. It's not like you plop some cows on the grass and be like, we got it. No.
Exactly. It's a lot harder than I thought it was going to be 20 years ago when we got into it. There's new challenges every day. So there's not a magic button. There's not a set program to do that. I will say that, there's got to be farmers working together. Otherwise, you're just going to have big farms that are only the ones that are going to be able to play. So to me, you've got to work together cooperatively. You've got to think of it as a business does, as far as selling. Who are we going to sell to? How are we going to get the product to them and so forth? All those kind of aspects. So we've talked about creating a 3-ring binder of here's all the aspects. It gets into the technology side. Like I was talking earlier about Indiana University. Well, we have EDI set up with them. So when a chef When he's planning his menu, it creates what he has to purchase from that. And that gets sent directly to us, goes directly into our computer system. And a lot of times, basically, if they get us that order by 8 a.m., we'll have it on a truck and delivered to them by 11 a.m. And so working through those kind of supply chain issues to make sure that you can be responsive. What we've talked with USDA about being this mid-tier regional food system. They've done a lot of things. They have a lot of support for regional food systems. And I view that as what probably dominates the smaller farmers is that you sell at farmers markets, you sell to individuals. And if that's what you want to do as a farmer, that's great. And I really promote that. And even though I'm promoting people go to our website, I also promote that, hey, just go to your neighbor farmer and try to buy the product there as well first. So I don't want to poo-poo that, but I also look at it and say, if we really are going to scale, as you were talking about earlier, you've got to get in this mindset of where do customers buy their meat from now? And it's at restaurants, it's at grocery stores, it's at schools. It's not as much at farmers market just because it's more inconvenient. And if you do have a farmers market that's very active and so forth, great, go make that happen. But in Indiana, anyways, it's just such a small percentage of the meat that's consumed.
There's been a dominant narrative among small farmers. And on this podcast, I need to be frank with you. Go to your local farmer's market. Talk to your farmer. Buy direct. And for many small producers, that model is meaningful, viable, and worth protecting. But what Dave is pointing to is something less romantic and more structural. If we're serious about changing food systems at scale, we have to meet people where they already buy their food. Grocery stores, restaurants, schools, institutions, not just where we wish they shopped. Farmers markets, while valuable, represent a tiny fraction of total meat consumption in many regions, including places like Indiana, where convenience, geography, and time shape eating habits far more than intention. This is where regional food systems matter, the mid-tier space between direct-to-consumer and industrial giants. It's also a reminder that we can't universalize solutions. What works in a dense, food-forward city may be unrealistic in rural or car-dependent regions. Access to high-quality food isn't just about awareness or values. It's about infrastructure, habits, and scale. Asking people to just buy local without building systems that make local food accessible in everyday places puts the burden on consumers and farmers alike while letting the larger system off the hook.
If we increase our production by like 5x, we'll still be less than 1% of the meat consumed in Indiana. So, we're still just a small subset of it. We'd like to obviously see that continue to grow and more farmers like us across every region.
And so when you're talking about mid-tier regional farms, they are maybe groups of farms that are working together like yours and delivering more meat than you can really through a farmer's market.
And then you also get into just the processing cost and the scale on that. So we've had a good partner that we've worked with since day one. We worked with them on building a new facility in 2021 to where we can do the quantity we're doing now, which again is about 40. We've had as high as 50 beef per week, 100 hogs. We see that continuing to grow. We're going through a major expansion that we're going to get started in April of this year. And it's an expansion for more volume, but more automation as well to reduce our processing cost. Because at the end of the day, that's where our costs are higher. And I've heard you on other podcasts talk about, you can't apologize for having high cost. And I totally agree with that. This is a quality product. It's sourced locally, but it's also really good quality. It's clean. I'm not afraid to charge more. But at the same time, you got to put yourself in the shoes of the restaurant, the university, the K through 12 school. They've only got so much money they can spend. So we're looking at things, how do we reduce our cost, both in raising the animal, but our biggest cost increase versus the big guys is our processing cost. If they're butchering 6,000 head a day, we're only butchering, 40 a week. So we're looking at how do we reduce our labor, how do we make that more efficient, and also our turnaround time. And so we're putting in high-speed lines. We're going to take our burger processing from now it's 7 manual steps. We're going to take that down to 2 steps. And we really think we're going to reduce our overall processing cost by a third.
And that's really the part of the puzzle where you can shave off dollars if you're maximizing efficiency. So you're not skimping on your cows and what
Right.
they're eating and how they're living. You're really trying to tighten the screws on the post-production side.
Exactly. And it's kind of interesting when we look at it overall, we are way more efficient once the product is produced and getting ready to go to the customer, because we ship it direct to the customer, or we have distributors that pick up at our location as a backhaul to their docks. So that works really good. We work with Piazza Produce in Indiana. We've worked with them since 2008. They've got trucks going across the state, 150 trucks. They deliver to local restaurants in our area. So after they're done delivering, they stop and pick it up, take it back to their warehouse in Indianapolis, then load trucks with it. It never goes into their finished goods inventory. It goes directly onto those routes that are getting delivered the next day. So again, from about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, they pick up from us, and it's at the customer's door at 6 a.m. the next morning. So we've got a very efficient supply chain. And again, we're not maintaining those huge cooler freezer warehouses and paying somebody to put it into inventory, paying somebody to manage it, paying for all that electricity to be used to keep it cold, and then paying someone to put it on a truck. We already know when we process the order where it's going. So no processing to finished goods, kind of a mantra of mine.
So I think about 65% of our spend is going through restaurants, right? Or spending our household food dollars, and that is from high end to low end, right? And I mean, a restaurant is going to eat way more on their weekday than any singular family is, but you are beefing up your direct to consumer, not just restaurants, but direct to my mailbox, essentially. Is that a priority?
Yes. Yeah. We look at it and saying, especially when COVID hit, that was kind of a scary time for us. I remember we had 14 beef hanging in the freezer. We had backed it off a little bit, and we get the calls that all the restaurants are shutting down, universities are shutting down. So that's the point when we pivoted to individual sales, and we got our website really working well and so forth, and subscription services and all that. But still to this day, it's less than 10% of our total sales. We've been really successful in selling to restaurants. We continue to grow that. We grew 33% in 24. We grew 18% last year. And most of that is to new restaurants that are interested, as well as K through 12 schools have been a big area of growth for us lately.
This conversation with Dave Fisher is one I keep thinking about, because what he offers isn't a slogan or a silver bullet. It's something much more valuable. Lived experience, paired with systems-level thinking. Dave shows us what it actually looks like to rebuild quality, transparency, and resilience from the ground up. Not in theory, but in practice. And I love how he is constantly looking for new ways to improve, even though he's in a good place. Respect. We talked about how beef really moves through the supply chain and why farmers so often lose power along the way. We talked about soil biology and methane, why the health of our land is inseparable from the health of our food. We talked about consolidation, processing, and how fragile our centralized systems revealed their structural and systemic weaknesses during COVID. And we talked about what it really takes to build regional food systems that can scale without becoming industrial. What stood out most to me is this: the answers aren't hidden. They're just rarely centered. When we listen to farmers like Dave, we stop debating abstractions and start seeing how food systems actually function, where they fail, and where they can be redesigned to work better for all of us. That's what One Bite is Everything is about. Bringing voices like this to the mic, connecting the everyday act of eating to the bigger questions we need to be asking right now. Because the future of our food system won't be decided by trends or headlines. It will be shaped by the choices we make because of what we know, the systems we support, and whether we demand something better. If this episode sparks something for you, share it, talk about it, ask some questions. Those small actions matter more than you think. Speaking of small actions, head on over to the show notes when you're done listening to this episode, and there is a special code there, 1BITE, and you'll get 25% off when you shop with Fisher Farms. Also, I'm counting on you to help me reach my goal of 100 reviews for One Bite is Everything this year. It only takes a minute. Stars matter. One Bite is Everything is a 5-star podcast in the top 3% of podcasts globally. Can you give the show a little support? I'd love it if you'd take a moment to rate and review One Bite is Everything on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. It might feel like a pain in the butt to leave me here and click and scroll to the review spot, but reviews really make a difference. They help this show reach more curious eaters, more thought leaders, and more people who are asking big questions about our food system or want to. And that's how these conversations grow. Will you do it? Just one review this year. Pretty please? Here's part of a recent review in case this inspires you. I love how One Bite is Everything sheds so much light on the problems and questions so many of us have, bringing experts to share their knowledge. I especially love that the host gives actual background facts and history throughout each episode. Thanks for listening to One Bite is Everything, the podcast that connects every bite you take to the bigger world. This episode was co-produced by Sonia Dillon with sound design and original music by Russell Chappa. I'm your host, Dana DePrima, and I'll see you here again next week for another conversation. Until then, eat like it matters, because it does.